All right. Well, greetings, everyone. Welcome to the session. There's a welcome sign or welcome note in the chat from the chair of the policy committee, which really is the sponsor of this session. This is a very informal conversation aimed at furthering discussions among the community and those of you who are here and anyone who chooses to view the recording later. Just think about policy, and it really is using the special issue of Educational Psychologist that recently came out as the springboard to that. So let me pull up my slides here. I'm just going to walk through a couple things, and here we go. Did it come up? Okay. All right. I'm just going to do that. All right. So welcome again. So this session is about the recent special issue of Educational Psychologist entitled Policy-Oriented Research. And he had seen the relevancy of educational psychology to policy. The goal is to have a conversation with the authors who contributed to this special issue. And you can see the list of authors there. I served as the guest editor and am providing some orientation and framework to the ensuing discussion we're about to have with the authors. So I thought it would be useful just to give a very brief rundown of how this special issue came into being and give you a little orientation to the contributions in the special issue to get everyone sort of oriented to how and why we got here. So this special issue, it really originated a long time ago, but the particular ideas for the special issue came from a APA presidential session in 2020, where I and some other folks came together to share thoughts about educational psychology and policy. And out of that, I thought, wow, we should kind of formalize this contribution into a special issue of Educational Psychologist. So it really started right in the start of COVID. And at the time, the original idea was to bring these collection of presentations together into a special issue. And over time, there was a little bit of shuffling of papers, a little bit of shuffling of ideas. And what came into vision around the goals of the special issue was it would be a first step in describing or offering some thoughts on the how and the why educational psychologists might think about policy in their work. So with that being said, the contributions are as follows. The first two pieces in the special issue really oriented around the why. These two pieces, the introduction by myself and Imogen Herrick, and then the next piece by myself and David Berliner, really center on making the case for why educational psychologists might want to consider more actively, more proactively, how policy fits within their research agenda. So these two pieces go at it slightly different ways, but ultimately the overarching goal is, again, the why, kind of making the case for why. And embedded in that, in making that case, it is looking at what educational psychologists have done up until now and identifying, really having to explore who are educational psychologists anyway, whereby it might make sense to make the case for why they might want to pursue this. So those two pieces do a little bit of that work. And then the next three, a framework for approaching policy-oriented educational psychology research by Kaplan, Transforming Fear into Rigor, Love, Freedom, and Joy by Zusho and colleagues, and then Communally Engaged Educational Psychology by Gray and colleagues. Those three are really examples of how might we do this? So in the lead up to this special issue, I've had myself and Imogen and perhaps others have had lots of conversations with different people in the community. And the question of how constantly arises. How do we do this work? What could it look like? And the answer is it depends. It's complicated. It could assume various forms. And one special issue is not going to lay out all the potential strategies, all the potential issues or complexities associated with how to do this work. But these three pieces, I think, are a really strong introduction, first step kind of set of exemplars for how one might think about doing this work. And I'll let them speak a little bit more about their contributions as we go through their answers to some questions we're going to have them think about. But generally speaking, Kaplan's piece provides a really nice framework, like sort of a step-by-step, if you will. It's not quite that simple, but a step-by-step sort of how to lay out research, where policy might feature in a research design and a research approach to a particular topic. Zusho piece is really interesting in a different way in that they take existing policy, national standards, describe what the policies are related to national standards, and then use educational psychology theories and frameworks for making the argument for why standards should be changed and how they should be changed. So that's an example of how to take an existing policy and sort of interrogate it. And the community engaged educational psychology is another sort of how, in terms of how you might approach a community with a policy question in mind, and what kind of strategies you might use to be mindful of the communities you're serving as you think about policy types questions in those communities. And then we have commentaries by Francesca Lopez and Jessica Gumby, and they both also speak to the how and why from their vantage points, while also looking back on the whole issue and the ways in which it comes together and ideas for how we should move forward, things that might be missing. So with that in mind, I thought it would be useful to kind of talk a little bit about my perspective in watching this process unfold, the process of authors having an idea, writing up their manuscript, submitting it for review, seeing the reviewer comments, seeing how authors respond to reviewer comments, and going through that process a couple times. And it did take a while, and there's a lot of back and forth. I don't know what's typical for EP. I don't know how often these back and forth, or how many times back and forths are on average happen, but it happened a lot with us. Some of it had to do with COVID, and there's a lot of delays and things like that. But there was really a very ongoing conversation that happened between the authors and the reviewers and myself and the editors of EP. But here's some general observations from start to finish. First, all authors were incredibly interested in doing this task and challenged by this task and really curious about how to do the task. But, you know, a lot were a little uncertain. How do I do this with policy? Because it's a newish way of thinking or a new type of idea. So that was a starting point. It was very clear too, or what was really exciting to see was how manuscripts evolved over time, sometimes quite radically. Everyone improving, of course, the conversation between authors and reviewers and that back and forth really revealed some high level questions about what you're trying to say, how you're trying to say it, what it means. And there was this real grappling around certain areas related to educational psychology, science, and education policy. Authors seem to enjoy the challenge, I'm going to assume. They found the process productive for helping them to think about policy. Anecdotally, I'm hearing that. I don't know what's going on behind closed doors, but I'm going to assume this is true. But this kind of leads to the goal of this webinar, is on the heels of hearing about these sort of personal insights that seem to emerge by going through this pretty arduous process that everyone went through, including myself. There was really sort of, at the end of the day, some revelations or emerging revelations about the type of scholarship authors are doing, how they do it, and how policy fits in. So some other examples of how the conversations between the reviewers and the authors, what they revealed. One core thing was everyone seemed to struggle with how to define policy. What does that mean? Authors and reviewers. And it kind of didn't matter the angle people were taking. There was always sort of an angst around this, it seemed, in everyone's voice and perspective. Authors might have a very clear idea of how they're thinking about policy, but then reviewers would come in and say, well, did you think about it this way or this way or this way? And that feedback is all legitimate, but somehow is not relevant to what the author was trying to say. But at the same time, the authors are trying to come in and meet the reviewers. Well, wait, maybe I didn't think about it that way. So there was always like this a back and forth, and like a lot of review process, sometimes you answer a question and it triggers another question, right? So it almost seems like this unending process. And that seemed to be very clear with questions of what is policy in this particular manuscript and the way I'm talking about it. Relevant to that is that all our authors were pushed to see ideas from various angles or considerations, certainly, but related to ed psych ed policy connections. For example, there's questions around how decisive we can be in using in the language we use to describe the implications of science to policy. As scholars, we tend to be very careful and cautious. We'd rather say things like this finding suggests, or the implications are X, Y, Z. Language that's a little more decisive, saying, hey, this finding means we shouldn't be doing high stakes testing, like a little more kind of conclusive, decisive. That makes people all nervous. And so there was wrangling around the appropriate way to frame those kinds of things. The well-trained scholars in us are tentative around that, and the sort of need to push policy or be a little more strident questions that. And Jessica Kurugumbi's commentary is especially enlightening because she pushes the field and her comments to see themselves more as advocates or advocacy work, doing research with advocacy in mind, sort of be a little braver, if you will, with how you talk about the science. So that's going to be an ongoing conversation and situational around how and when to do that and when it might be appropriate. But that was an interesting sort of intersection that came out. The other piece that seemed to came out are any places or manuscripts that was about how to do this work. There was pushback or back and forth around how prescriptive to be, because key here is the idea that educational psychologists vary widely. We vary in the methods we use, we vary in the sort of orientations we take, maybe our identities. And so sometimes there would be sort of a back and forth about how well people are treating a particular approach or a particular method with policy in mind. So we're very critical of one another in good ways to kind of further our thinking around which is a better approach. So kind of laying out the how-to can be dangerous, because to a different type of someone who embraces a different methodology might say, whoa, that doesn't make sense over here. And so that was another interesting conversation around the how to do this. And that sort of is the last bullet point as well. So with that in mind, I think the goal of the rest of our time today is I'm going to pose questions and ask authors to speak to them. And if we have time at the end, I'll let you all can ask questions, but please use the chat as well to weigh in at any time. So I guess what I'll do is I'll just start. The first question I have for our authors is, if I can get it in front of me now. So what did you learn about policy from working on this manuscript? And I'm going to ask Avi to kick us off. What did you learn, or what thoughts came to mind about what policy is as you worked on your piece?
Thank you for organizing this, and thank you for the opportunity to work on this project. I was one of the authors on the APA session. Sharon invited me to participate, and that was a wonderful opportunity to reflect now on my relationship with policy throughout my career. And what happened working on the manuscript, I realized that it was reflecting a meandering journey that I had with policy in relation to educational psychology. And throughout my academic career, I've been interested in the role of context in motivation and engagement and learning. And already as a graduate student in the University of Michigan, and Revathy is here, she was a graduate student with me, and Akane, and the conversation we had with Marty Mayer and Carol Midgley, and to some degree with Jackie Eccles and Paul Pintrich, around achievement goal theory and motivation more generally, were around policies such as evaluation systems and recognition systems and accountability systems and standards, and how these shaped school cultures to emphasize performance goal structures versus mastery goal structures. But at least for me, we treated such policies as an overarching context, like philosophical context, rather than specific foci for our research questions, and we focused more on the individual students' perceptions and student achievement goals. So they were in the background, but I wasn't thinking about them in a sophisticated way. They were definitely framing Marty's thoughts and Carol's thoughts, but not our specific research. And it wasn't until about 10 years ago when I started working with complex dynamic systems that I started thinking about policies in a more specific way. And what happened, I organized a session in ARA in a motivation SIG, a big panel about complexity in motivation. And we talked about it, challenging the mechanistic system of motivation. And then at the end, an audience member asked me, so what are the implications for policymakers? And I said, I have no idea what the implications are for policymakers. So that started me on a thinking like, what would it mean to translate this to policy, and started looking at policy more specifically. And then Sharon came and said, I want to do this, presidential session. Will you join? And I said, well, I've been thinking about it. I don't know exactly what I'm thinking about it, but it's an opportunity. So what I learned from working on that presentation, and then more specifically on this paper, was one, I learned to conceptualize policies as motivational interventions at their core. So what policymakers aim to do is influence people's motivations, decisions, and actions in particular contexts. So that was one frame that I learned to do. The second thing was, and this was done together with Ben Brock, who was a doctoral student of mine, and his dissertations on the role identity of policymakers. I learned to think about policymakers as having identities, and policies, like other motivational interventions, to think about policies as reflecting ideologies, values, beliefs about the human condition and behavior, beliefs about attributions, goals, prioritizing goals, etc. So, resonating with the earlier achievement goal theory work, policies should be evaluated and can be evaluated constructively by motivational theories. And the third thing, that like other motivational interventions, or actually more general interventions in complex dynamic systems, and the analogy that I'm making now is to medicine interactions and contraindications, is that and the effect of every policy reflects its simultaneous operations with other motivational influences, other policies, other contextual characteristics on a particular system, human system, in which they are implemented. So all of this led me to understand this as one factor in a complex dynamic systems, where the intention is to improve the human condition by changing people's motivations. And you can do it with different motivational ideologies, behaviorism as the main guiding principle, constructivism, social cognitive, humanistic. So, and you can evaluate policies in that way. What I haven't done until Sharon invited me to do the special issue was I didn't explicate to myself, what does it mean to research specifically in a way that acknowledges the role of policies in a particular educational psychological phenomenon in context? And this is what working on the presentation and the paper did. And I clarified, it was a dialogue with myself, clarified to myself how I would like to do this.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for that. I'm just going to, in the interest of time, again, please use the chat if things are coming up to mind as people are talking. But I want to get everyone's voices. So Akane, you, Revathy, Rhonda, does someone want to speak to this? What did you learn about policy in doing this work? And you all have really animated me a lot because you have been the ones that have been most vocal and sharing, like, I'm learning a lot. So eager to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I would say Avi used the word meandering. I think that's a great description still of my developing understanding of policy. I do, now that he said that, I'm like, yeah, I guess we've always been interested in issues of policy, even back in grad school, but it was not made explicit. we didn't have explicit conversations around policy, at least at that time, although we did talk about culture. And I do think like my interest in policy probably is tied to my interest in culture, because I think of policies as, ways in which culture is transmitted and sustained over time. But I didn't make that connection until fairly recently, which is, I don't know what that says about me. But I also feel like, I guess specifically to the paper, and again, I would invite Revathy and Rhonda to chime in. I think what I really learned is that this work is really complex. We actually started, our first draft does not look anything like our final draft. And we initially started thinking that we're going to focus on teacher related stuff, right? Teacher policies, and in particular around issues of culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy. And I think we realized that, and I think, as a result of those conversations with the reviewers and also with Sharon, that maybe that wasn't the best approach to take. And we started to think more about, well, where did these teacher policies come from? And a lot of it comes really from sort of like at the student level, right? So one of the things I've really have grown to appreciate is sort of the interconnectedness of all these policies. So like, student policy, students related like standards, which is what our paper ultimately became focused around, really do dictate a whole host of policies. And so I think we became interested in trying to get at the root. And so that's why we shifted our focus to sort of the student standards. I also, in terms of like the complex dynamic system that Avi's talking about, these things are it is very all interconnected. And I learned a lot about, because Sharon actually pushed us to do sort of a historical review of the standards-based accountability movement. And in doing so, I've learned a lot about how federal, state, and local policies are all really interconnected, and also the historical context matters, and trying to understand that who crafts policies really matter, I think. And that historical review made me appreciate, I guess, I don't know if that's the right word, but at least made me understand that a lot of our educational policies really do reflect the interests of, frankly, white men, because they've really been the people at the forefront. I've also grown to understand that science has definitely played a role in crafting these policies over time, but there's also these other external players, often businessmen, politicians, and Sharon, you said we need to be more bold, and I think we do, because of these other external forces who really actually sometimes exert more influence than the scientists on crafting of these policies. So I'll stop there, and I'll turn it over to Revathy or Rhonda if you guys have anything you want to say.
Well, I agree with everything you said, Akane, and yes, you do make a good point, Avi, when you say that we came through the system and we thought of, and we've written all these papers. And I know that I have, adding to what both of you have said, I was always interested in culture and motivation and how it informs learning and so forth. And so I have to confess that when I first got Sharon's email, she said, "Oh, and this is a policy issue." And I said, "Yeah, I'm really interested. I want to know how you create these make policies that really promote learning for all students, particularly the marginalized students." And the next thing was I didn't know what to do. SOS to Akane and Rhonda. I said, "Okay, I need help. I don't know what I'm doing here, honestly." But now I just want to add that it was a wonderful experience, because in the process of doing this, yes, we evaluated, we looked at all the, requirements and standards for teacher education, and everywhere it says, oh, and one of the standards is you've got to make your curriculum such that it is really diverse. You should attend to the needs of culturally diverse students. And then when you look at students' standards, it reflects the same things, and all these state in if you look at their mission and so on, it is so high flown, and it really speaks to what our paper article talks about. It talks about rigor. It says critical thinking, and so forth. They emphasize all these things, but in reality, we are not doing that. So the one thing that in the interest of time, I'll just add that the one thing that it has made me think, because all the while I think, how can we make it so that we're really and truly responsive to student needs? And in the process, I particularly focused on freedom and joy, and it's the joy of learning, and we read all these Black authors, which was so uplifting and empowering. And I said, this is what standards should be. But now I'm left with the question, how do I train? Okay, it is not sufficient to have this on paper that they should make learning engaging. Doesn't really capture joy, but how do you make it joyful? How do you empower students? What policies should be there to empower? And it also the realization that if we want to really bring about these changes, we have to start at the grassroots level, start with schools, then school districts, and moving on. What do these constructs mean for policy? And one of the conversations that we had, which I thought is really important, every standard speaks to achievement. What do we mean by achievement? What do we mean by learning? And so I think we need to bring these to the attention of people in charge of making policies. Probably we should be there. And so how do you get into those positions? Or at least how do we encourage, upcoming educational psychologists we really need to get into positions where our research makes a difference in policies, and not just have it as, in the discussion in our manuscripts. And this has great implications for policies and practices. Doesn't suffice. We have to move beyond that. And I'll stop there.
Just summarize for us, I think the historical roots and really thinking about policy as reflecting and connecting to the historical roots and the identity of the people putting forth the policy, and really interrogating and questioning the extent that the people the policy is designed to serve are engaged in the development and enacting of the policy. I think one of the things that I learned about policy is that policy is not neutral. It has an identity, and that the policy actually does shape our feelings and our experiences, both the process and the product. And so we really focused on how we might reimagine policy and education, moving away from fear to the types of feelings and experiences that we aspire to have ourselves and for all of our learners.
Yeah, and you guys were such a cool evolution to watch, because we are so good you are all very good at arguing what we should be doing and how educational psychology theorizing and frameworks, what they have to offer, what standards should look like. But the missing piece that was worked on the most was, but why? And that's where an interrogation of the policy that drives the behavior is where, had to kind of keep pushing you to get you all to look. Because even at the starting point, and I think this is common for a lot of folks kind of new to this thinking, is we're thinking about individuals, we're thinking about teachers and teacher practice, we're thinking about students and how students behave and motivation and their achievement. But you're not thinking about where it comes from. What are the forces, the layered forces, if you will, sort of bearing down? And for whatever reason, over a long time of thinking about that, I go there first, and then I think through the trickle down effect, if you will. And so it's sort of like taking our strengths and now expanding what we understand to understand what are the policies that are sort of driving or related to these activities, processes, outcomes that we study and we know a lot about. And so seeing you all make those connections was really cool to see. And by the end, the historical accounting that you got to on the standards was just really well done, because it was just really on point, showing sort of how schools have been conceptualized over time by these power makers as written into the rules, as conveyed down through the system over time. And that clearly affects what teachers do. Yeah, so I want to move to, thank you all for that. I want to move to DeLeon and your co-authors. And the question, DeLeon, I know you signed on a little late, is what did you learn and what thoughts emerged about ed policy as you worked on your manuscript for the special issue? What did you learn about policy?
Greetings, everyone. I am here. I'm off camera just because I'm in a spot with family right now. And so you may hear a cute voice in the background. That is my 16-month-old son. There are a couple things that we learned by working on this manuscript. One of the biggest is, the process of articulating the connection between policy and practice for us. And so one of the things that I've always thought about in my career is like, at first I thought like, okay, I'm not really concerned with policy change that may or may not happen if I advocate for change. Because at the end of the day, the work is really on the ground. But one thing that became clear to me over time was that, local decisions that are made all the time also count as policy. And they provide a proof of concept, if you will, within a school district so that, it may lead to more widespread adoption or even interest. So over the course of working on this manuscript, several things happened. We were actually engaging in communally engaged approaches. And so, not only were the reviewers providing us feedback on our articulation of certain ideas, but in real time, we're talking about our experiences and our model really coming to life in the communities that we were doing the work in. And so we became preoccupied with the idea that, connecting with folks on the ground and building with them and elevating their insights and voices and leveraging our platform was a solid way to build out policy advocacy. The reason why is because we are going to sound like researchers talking, but when they talk to people who are making policies, they sound like people who are experiencing things. There's emotion that they experience that comes out in conversations. There's also a number of insights and stories that are shared as well. So the biggest thing that we wanted to emphasize in this paper was that building with folks on the ground can create a movement. And the more people that you have on the ground who are advocating for the same changes as you are, the more believable it actually is. And so it's not that research itself, this should not be credible and authentic, but that speaks to certain types of people. But what kind of data do the policymakers around you speak? And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how we can engage, in unity with the people that we're trying to serve to make sure everything that we're elevating is authentic and meaningful to them. And so just as a back story around things that have happened since then, there's a lot of ways that we've worked and partnered with schools and even students. And just last week, a superintendent requested a meeting just because he heard about some of the things that we had going on from the people on the ground. And so, having impacted people on the ground or worked with them to develop something that was impactful is a good way to get someone's ear. And it's not necessarily going to come directly from data or evidence. The policymakers sometimes use research to, support decisions that they already want to make, unfortunately. And so a stronger proof of concept, I find, is to actually have built something in a local community and built out. Al, do you want to chime in, or Brooke?
Sure, I'm happy to chime in a couple quick thoughts. But yeah, I think some of the things that we worked through as part of the review process was really trying to think about, what is our role as educational psychologists who are doing sort of an applied science? And what's the balance between basic research and applied research? And then how do we mediate the two? And then how does policy also play a role in this conversation? And how do we translate ed psych to different stakeholders? So policymakers are often speaking, like to points that were shared earlier, a different language than what we're speaking as educational psychologists. Business folks have big roles to play. How are we, translating our findings to them in a way that makes sense to someone who's used to speaking in marketing speak? And then, I think too, for us, we were really trying to keep top of mind who are the kind of end users of the policy, and teachers and students being at the forefront of that. And how do we work with them as part of our research process in a way that's sustainable? So we thought a lot about, having research be a process that unfolds over time, acknowledging our history as educational psychology researchers, and that there's some parts of our history that have maybe felt more extractive and less sustainable in terms of how we're partnering with educators in the research process. And so really trying to push back and think, what does the future look like? How can we partner with teachers and students that make their voices heard, where they're, equal contributors to ultimately what we're communicating back to the policymakers and the business professionals who are really driving a lot of the changes that teachers and students are grappling with in the day-to-day on the ground. One quick thing I wanted to just elevate from a reviewer comment, which was really interesting and I think had to do with the timing of this happening during COVID, was thinking about public health and medical research as a potential example in some ways of like a research field that is doing this differently than educational psychology historically has done. So really trying to connect, the basic medical research to applications in the public health field. And that was an interesting comment from the reviewers that really made me like the wheels turn of like, are there other fields that we can look towards as examples of how to work, more seamlessly with policy and, educators on the ground.
Wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and turn to Imogen. Do you want to add anything to this or have any thoughts? You've been thinking about policy for a long time. Has this experience helped you think about policy in any different way or new ways?
Yeah, I was so excited to read the pieces in the special issue because I look up to a lot of the authors that were in it, but it was really interesting to see how they framed all of this through an educational psychology lens. But I think for me, it was really about being a teacher for so long. I was a teacher for 12 years and coming into a program and really loving educational psychology because it made so much sense as something to continue to study. But being in a program where I had policy classes and not knowing how to reconcile the two things and understand how to develop a scholarly identity when I was interested in things that didn't seem to mesh together as well. And so that's how I ended up chatting with Sharon. And over my years with Sharon and us kind of bouncing ideas back and forth, I've been able to really develop sort of my own little inner advocacy around policy and educational psychology, where teachers really need to understand the connections as well so that they can push back on these local policies that may be top down to them, but they still have agency because they're still so much smaller and they haven't had that opportunity to become more widespread. So really helping teachers to become advocates and arming them with the science to be advocates in their places, I think has really I think this special issue has highlighted that a lot. And I also think that that's where I've landed over a lot of years of looking at policy with you, Sharon, and thinking about it. So for me, it's about understanding that those policies are probably the ones that I feel like have the most impact every day on students. And so as an educational psychology community, I think we have a lot to offer teachers, buildings, superintendents, those folks that are in the smaller scale aspects of policy to help them navigate and form policies that are much more healthy for individuals that are under them.
Wonderful. Thank you, Imogen. Okay, so I had like 5 questions. We just got through one and we have 20 minutes. So good job. So I think we're just going to do one more and ask y'all to, couple minute sort of synopsis best you can, and then we want to open it up. And please use the chat if you have questions. Don't hesitate there. So this next and last one is, what are your future plans for doing policy engaged work? What ideas has this sparked for your future kind of work? And we'll just go in the same order so y'all know who's up. So Avi, you get to go first again. Do you have future plans for policy engaged work?
I think that after writing this and realizing that if we ignore policy, then our theories are actually not valid and not authentic. I think that policy is going to become, and the role of context, I think that policy is going to become an inherent and integral aspect of everything that I write about, in that it is a feature of the context. So I think that I'll just say that and
wonderful.
In all the projects, yes.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Akane?
Yeah, I would have to agree. This experience has been transformative in so many ways, but it has underscored to me how important it is for me personally to get more involved in conversations around policy, both at the local level. This made me, I do sometimes consult at the governmental level, and it made me really interested in what goes on there and how to get on these boards that, seem to have such influence. But more locally, I do work with New York City Public Schools. And one of the things that this has made me appreciate is how conflicting sometimes policies are. And even though we all want students to learn and thrive, that there are these existing policies that sometimes get in the way. And I'm really becoming much more interested in structural change, and obviously policy work is going to be a part of that. And so right now I'm still studying and learning, but hopefully I do aspire to become that scholar advocate, or whatever the terminology that Jessica used in her commentary. And she's right, we need to do more. So yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Revathy or Rhonda, do you have anything you want to add or offer? Future work?
I have all these thoughts swirling in my head at this point, I think. And but one thing I do realize that it is that I need to go beyond these writings. For one thing, I have been and I've got more interested in sort of some philosophical issues, which seem even harder to translate into policies and practice. But I really think it's important, and I've had a couple of conversations with principals particularly where one of the things that they're all required was that implicit bias training, and I never have liked that training. And I said, how can we change this, and how can we bring up, make it more positive so teachers feel I can become open-minded. And I've been moving in that direction, but I still have a long ways to go. But that's why I said it's still swirling in my head.
Okay, cool. Rhonda?
I'll just say that recently I wrote testimony and spoke at the New York City Council Joint Committee on Education and Technology when they had questions on teacher education. And I 2 years ago or 3 years ago, before working on this paper, I never would have thought to write testimony. And when I was there, I was really glad to be there. And I just encourage all of you to look for your local committees and just to join a meeting, and as a citizen to give testimony, to offer a perspective of science and research at these meetings when there are not a lot of people who can bring that knowledge into the conversation.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. DeLeon and your team?
Yes, so there's a couple things that I want to mention. The first is around coalition building. I say that because in North Carolina, Essentially, I'm a part of a coalition that has developed some racial equity policy priorities. We developed 9 specifically. Now we're going through the process of developing SMART goals, and also just thinking about collaboration across those, because each organization functions at a different level of altitude. Some people are more focused on direct communication with school districts. Other people are boots on the ground, but we all work together and we can all play our role effectively. So that's one. So coalition building is one. The second has to do with intermediary organizations. I don't believe that I'm the person that needs to be the first person in the room speaking about the work. Certain people already have connections and can knock down certain doors. So letting them know what insights are emerging from the research and letting them kind of, open that door for the work a bit, makes it so I can keep focusing on the work and allowing the message to get out there. And when, the environment is right, I can come into the room and be more effective. The third is around media. I think it's very important to show and give community groups and people on the ground credit for their insights and ideas. And media is an effective way of doing that. And so through engaging videos and, short explainer videos, or even just videos with us just talking about our process together, it's been an effective way to build more community and get more excitement going. And we've captured the imagination of school districts and board members who are interested in the work. The fourth is process metrics. So measuring how many education stakeholder recommendations did we listen to as we have built out our research project or our action projects. And so holding ourselves accountable to the process metrics along the way gives us a sense that we're headed in the right direction with policy impacts. And so Brooke has been doing fantastic work. She is a school board member, and she serves on school boards while being a graduate student. And so I'd love to hear from her and Al, because I know they have amazing things to say as well.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. One of the things I was thinking about regarding this is that in our paper, we talk about how important it is to create a philosophy of engagement, or clearly stated set of values when you head into partnership work, so that everyone kind of knows where you're coming from, the intentions are clear. And so as I think about doing research that's trying to engage policy and maybe influence policy, I think that same kind of clarity of vision, values-driven intention, really explicit about how I'm talking about and framing and thinking about those types of things seems like a really important, just an important, I guess, piece of how I want to do policy work going forward. Because I just think when community members, are thinking through what's important for them, what matters for their district, and then you come in maybe as a researcher with resources and you have your own intentions and things. I think it's just very valuable to know upfront that we're on the same page about where we're trying to head, and how, and the value we place on how we get there, even for that to be shared. And so from this paper, I feel like that was a pretty significant takeaway for me, is just like the clarity of how the philosophy we're using for how to engage in policy work and communal work in different communities. And so I even think about that as a school board member now. We've had a lot of turnover, and we're kind of needing to go back to the basics of like, what is our school board's kind of set of values, so that we can know the frameworks we're using to make decisions out of. And I think it's right to invite that kind of thinking into research, because it deals with real people's lives, real communities. It has real implications on people, real people. So to not treat it with the impersonable and like to make it untangible or intangible, I think creates a kind of distance where we don't feel the impact of whether this helps or hurts. And so when you're in there with people, I think it puts more of that responsibility and onus on, like, we need to make sure we're clear that our intentions are guiding us, that we've got, we're using those set of values that we've talked about and have agreed upon to evaluate whether we're being effective or not. Just having a partnership is not the end all. You know, I need to make sure it's actually contributing in the way that we stated we would. So those are the kinds of things that I'll certainly be thinking of going forward. As a school board member, as a researcher, I'm hoping to continue the partnership. Those become really important.
Thank you. Al, did you want to add anything? Or...
Oh, sure. The only thing that I would add is I've been thinking a lot about our role as educational psychologists in teacher education and teacher preparation. I know a lot of us, that's part of our roles within the academy, is working within teacher education and thinking about, you know, what's our responsibility as educational psychologists to make sure that we're preparing teachers to navigate the policy mandates that are going to be handed down to them, and then knowing that these policies are coming at different levels, you know, from the federal government to local government to within their buildings, that, you know, principals have different policies that they're enacting. And, you know, and I've thought about this in different ways, but really thinking about educational psychologists, that we have a lot of really great methods we use in our work, and that our methods can really help our teacher education students be critical consumers of what they're receiving within their context once they enter the classroom. So that was one thing that I've been mulling over, and I know that there's interest in this group of teacher education and teacher preparation. So
for sure, it might be a good segue to Imogen. You've have the last thought here on the future of policy.
Hopefully not the last thought. No, I couldn't agree more with Al. Like, I really feel like that's a place where we can really plug in with our pre-service teacher candidates and trying to help any teachers in general, even the ones that we might be in a community engaged relationship with, but just helping them realize that they can be agentic within their situations, and that they can bring to the table good science that can push back or promote whatever policies are being constructed, because I think that's really a huge value add for a school, for a community, if we have teachers that are equipped to understand the possible perils of a policy or the possible, you know, potential of a policy, but understanding it from a scientific lens and from understanding it from how people learn and what creates good learning environments and all of the things that educational psychologists know a lot about. And so for me, I think for next steps, one thing that Revathy said really just struck me, like, what does a policy look like that has the goal of empowerment? Like, that is such a cool question to like actually tackle and think about. And so that's really, for me today, that's what I'm leaving with.
Yeah, that's really cool. Well, thank you all so much for your contributions as authors. I want to ask, we have a few more minutes left. Is any those of you attending, what questions do you have about anything that's been shared or anything even not shared in this area? Would love to hear from you all. Thoughts, comments, or questions? I don't know if I can see the chat. So is there anything in the chat, Diana?
Nothing in the chat right now.
Okay. So I will try to exhibit wait time.
And everyone should be able to unmute themselves. So, you know, if you have a question, you can just unmute yourself.
Yeah, so mute, speak up. Maybe even thinking about what does this cause you to think about in your own work related to policy? Would anyone like to? Michael, did you just unmute?
Yeah, I wasn't going to address that particular question, but
okay, yeah.
I did have some comments, you know, so as most of you probably don't know, I have a master's degree in public policy and worked for the California legislature for 8 years. And I found, and I'm still wondering what, even though I was going through a policy program, I still don't really know what policy is. It can mean a lot of different things. So you're not, you know, out of line in thinking that. But I did find, you know, analyzing bills and what they cost and what their benefits were, it was all sort of meaningless without the psychology, without getting, you know, down to the individual, how we learn, and as well as organizational dynamics. So we did distinguish between policy formation how something becomes a law, and policy implementation. Those are concepts that, and some other concepts that policy scholar you might learn by reading policy scholars and policy books, but policy implementation, both of those are embedded in complex systems, like Avi mentioned. So I would sort of discourage making, simplistic ideas about the power structure, because power structure is very complicated. And it can be characterized, but it needs to be interrogated. And policy implementation is also very complex. And a lot of it is done by what they call street level bureaucrats, which is a very nice, that was the title of an article that was supposed to be provocative, that it was actually the people on the front line that make policy. And so I think this whole effort of sort of doing community building and organizational development and those sort of things, make a lot of sense. So I'm really excited on how this whole thing is shaping up and the many directions that it's taking. So.
Yes, thank you, Michael. Michael has to be credited for starting the policy committee, approaching me years ago to get that started, and it's thriving and a lot of good things happening. So any other comments, final comments from any of the authors want to share for the good of the order?
I'd like to pose a question to Brooke now. It's about the process of working on this paper as a graduate student. I'm sure there were a lot of things that you thought about, or that we thought about, in terms of audience and impact, and who was likely to be most impacted by this, and who we see this paper for. Can you tell us a bit about the process from the perspective of a graduate student, and who you hope to really pick up this paper and run with it?
So it was fun and a little challenging to work on this, in addition to doing our dissertations and whatnot. But I think we were writing this really for graduate students, so Brooke and I, as co-authors, we're writing this for graduate students and also for graduate student advisors, graduate program directors, and really thinking, how can we make sure that graduate students are going to be set up to think about policy as an important part of their work when they enter the field as educational psychologists, and all the different spaces that graduate students are in. Brooke and I both came into our graduate program having been K-12 teachers. And so I think that was, similar to Imogen, top of mind for us too. We were really driven to educational psychology as a field because of our struggles in the classroom. And having really big policy-oriented questions when we entered graduate school, and then feeling, a little bit of a rub as graduate students of, I'm learning a lot about science and methods, but I'm not able to connect the dots on how this is going to impact students and teachers. And so I think, in our article, we were trying to push a little bit some thinking on, graduate student preparation and trying to give graduate students a framework to work from in our article. So yeah, I was writing it for grad students, I will say.
The only thing I would add is just sometimes you just need to see an example that it can be done, that you don't have to wait to engage in policy work until after you've got tenure, and now you can start to think that way. So that was encouraging to me personally. And then hopefully other people pick up on that message too, that the time is now. The time is always right to start thinking about those broader implications. So.
Yes, and this is very affirming to hear, because a lot of my motivation stems from conversations with graduate students, early career folks, and my own angst around, what does our work matter? How can we make it matter? And for me, the connection has been through this arc of policy, and it's opened up this whole world of questions of how to do it and why to do it and all sorts of things that have just been really fulfilling. But that's really exciting to hear, because I think we do want our work to matter, and there's lots of ways it can matter. Policy is not the only way. And I also want to acknowledge that people have been doing policies, not necessarily a new idea, to think about policy. it's been an itch for me to really spend a lot of time there. So that's exciting that folks are thinking about it in similar ways. And I just want to thank you all. I see time is out, time is valuable. So we'll end there. Thank you all so much for attending. Thank you all the authors for doing this really important work and producing really wonderful pieces. I hope everyone has a chance to read through them, and I'll just speak for everyone to say we're available if there's questions, and certainly you can reach out to me directly if there's any questions. And please consider the policy committee if you're looking for service. Lots of things to do there as well. Anything else, Diana?
No, that sounds great. Thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, thank you all very much.
Bye.